Thankfully, the parties came together and they were able to pass a 2-year budget. But really what they did is they found workarounds around a lot of those fiscal guardrails.
We know that 2026 isn't a budget year, but these conversations are really going to continue.
Oh, they most definitely are, given the uncertainty coming out of Washington.
Now, on the contrary, there were some pretty significant, positive legislation that was passed.
We really see this as one of the biggest economic wins that we've had in decades here in Connecticut. Within 2 months, we were able to not only draft a comprehensive bill, but also get it passed through both chambers and signed by the governor.
Thanks for joining the BizCast powered by Google. I'm Amanda Marlowe, and I'm here with what should be a very familiar face now to CBIA members, our head of public policy, Chris Davis. Welcome.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me again.
Last time we had you on, it was at the beginning of the session. We had just gotten underway. Everyone was fresh, ready to go. Now we're a couple days post-session, and I imagine you're a bit tired.
Yeah, a lot of long nights right at the end of session, especially in those last few days, but we're able to kind of sit back, kind of reevaluate how everything went. A lot of bills get passed in those final few hours, so sometimes you're just checking on what actually got through in those last couple of hours of the session. So we're ready to talk about, how the session went and kind of the impact that it had on the business community.
Yeah, and at the focus for CBIA was this Reimagine Connecticut policy pledge. We released it in 2025. The solutions centered around affordability, workforce, quality of life, and business climate. We are going to kind of touch upon those in our conversation today, but really, at the top of the list for CBIA this session was maintaining those fiscal guardrails. There was a lot of discussion, especially about the budget in these last couple of days. Where did we land? How far outside of the fiscal guardrails did the legislature stray?
Sure. In those last couple of days, you had a lot of back and forth between the governor's office, legislative leaders, in particular in the Democratic Party, who were really working hard to put together that budget. And there were some discussions about even just doing a 1-year budget, just kind of band-aid ourselves, if you will, to the next fiscal year, given the uncertainty in Washington. But thankfully, the parties came together and they were able to pass a 2-year budget. Under their calculations, it's under the spending cap by less than $1 million, which is razor thin in a over $22 billion budget. So you have a situation where we might be finding ourselves back in the next few months, whether changes in the Washington and the uncertainty that's happening there and the cuts that could be coming, that could call them back into special session. But really what they did is they found workarounds around a lot of those fiscal guardrails. They were able to kind of channel money from on the budget into other accounts so that they can avoid being under that spending cap, avoid going over that. They were able to then raise the volatility cap and the threshold that's involved with that so that they could spend more money under the spending cap because of that, to the tune of over $1 billion over those 2 years. So this was truly a workaround of those fiscal guardrails. Now, we are thankful that they are still in place. They weren't removed, they weren't eliminated, but they found ways to get around them, which is really troubling because for us in the business community, they're not just talking points, these caps. They are truly what gives us predictability, sustainability, and stability for us to be able to make decisions on where to make investments, whether we want to invest here in Connecticut, whether we want to grow the workforce here. Those are real decisions that are being made based off of whether that budget is sustainable and stable. And with those workarounds, we're really setting ourselves up for potential tax increases to pay for all those major spending changes that they're making, or just that unpredictability of not knowing if those spending allocations are going to last and if taxes are going to be needed to kind of backfill in the years to come.
Yeah. And one of the things that we kept talking about was needing that certainty and predictability in the business community here at home in Connecticut. And this is certainly something that we feel didn't give businesses what they need.
Yeah, because what they did is set up a scenario where now we need to find ways to pay for this spending in the future. They were able to use one-time moving around surpluses of this year to pay for things for next year. They were able to move things under the spending cap and under the volatility cap to try to fill those holes for this year. But what that really does is set us up for some trouble in the years to come. And things that we've been talking about for years, why those fiscal guardrails were so important, because they provided that stability and certainty that we needed to know that those big spending increases and those big tax hikes that were the past, 10 years ago weren't going to happen going forward because we had this structure put in place. Now, finding ways to get around them, really boosting up that spending beyond what we can really afford is what gives us a lot of pause, because we're saying, that's going to lead to future tax increases, something that we know that businesses simply can't afford here in Connecticut.
We know that 2026 isn't a budget year, but these conversations are really going to continue.
Oh, they most definitely are, given the uncertainty coming out of Washington, unknowns about whether there's going to be additional cuts in any kind of reconciliation bill that comes out of the Capitol there. So that could lead them to having to come back into special session as early as this fall to try to make up some of those cuts. But we're thankful because of those fiscal guardrails. We have over $4 billion sitting in the rainy day fund that's available to kind of backfill any of those major spending cuts. And we at CBIA are advocating for usage of that rather than coming back and saying, oh, we need to raise taxes or we need to increase spending outside of those fiscal guardrails. We say that we have done a really good job about putting money away for these exact type of situations. And it's much more important for us to take advantage of that than it is for us to continue that ever increasing spending and potential tax hikes in the future.
One of the words you said is tax increases. We did see some significant tax increases on the business community out of this budget. What kind of message does that send to businesses?
Well, it was very disappointing because we've had record surpluses here in the state of Connecticut over the last several years since the 2017 reforms took place. And for the legislature to say, well, that's still not good enough. We want to spend even more and have over $350 million worth of tax increases on businesses here in the state of Connecticut really sends the wrong message. And it says to the business community, maybe it's not the right place to invest. If we're going to be continuing to increase spending, we're going to be continuing to look for ways to tax you in order to afford it. It sends really the wrong message, and one that, quite frankly, we didn't need to do. It wasn't necessary. We had surpluses. We had the ability to prioritize spending. And unfortunately, legislators and the governor chose to raise taxes on our employers here in the state.
Moving on to workforce, a really important theme, but sticking on the budget topic as well was childcare. There was some, pretty large childcare policy issues that, came out of this session. Can you talk a little bit about that? Yeah, childcare is a topic that I think is a rare thing in our political world today, where every party talks about it, saying how important it is to expand affordable access to it. You saw the governor and the legislature coming up with different ideas. We at CBIA had our own ideas about how childcare could be funded and expanded. Ultimately, what got passed was a program that's off budget into an endowment that the governor proposed that will fund access to affordable healthcare for families making less than $100,000 will be no cost, and people above $100,000 will be a small percentage of their income up to a certain income threshold. We're happy to see that this expansion happens, because getting more people back into the workforce, having them have the ability to afford that childcare in order to go back to work is very important. But we just felt like there was much better ways that we could have funded it and be more sustainable over a longer period of time. So we're hopeful that in the years to come, as perhaps that funding starts to run dry or doesn't come into fruition because surpluses get shrunk, that we'll be able to work with the legislature and the governor in the future to be able to come up with a more sustainable model for funding these programs. One of the other topics that we hear a lot from the business community, as well as the overall, general public in Connecticut, is the topic of healthcare. But we didn't see a lot of health headlines coming out in the last couple of weeks about healthcare. Can you talk about some of the discussions that were had and some of the legislation that was, discussed?
Well, we hear over and over again that the cost of healthcare for employees, especially of small businesses, and then also for the employers themselves, has just been skyrocketing over the last several years, and one of the largest cost drivers for businesses and their employees here in the state. And unfortunately, the legislature didn't really make any positive movement in the direction of trying to lower those costs this year. Efforts by CBIA and others to try to have association health plans and other ways to try to drive down those costs really kind of fell on deaf ears this year. Didn't really get a lot of support, if you will. So what we ended up having to do, unfortunately, was play a lot of defense this year as far as healthcare goes. And we were very successful in preventing some major changes that really would have drove up the cost of healthcare for small employers here in the state, like the elimination of stop loss coverage or ways that would have driven up the cost of healthcare and the responsibility for those small employers in order to fund them before any kind of additional coverage kicks in. So we were successful in that respect of cost avoidance and trying to keep steady as far as the cost of healthcare go, but we're certainly disappointed that the efforts that we've made along with some of our friends and partners in the small business community to try to lower those costs, unfortunately, were not addressed this session.
You think it was a missed opportunity?
A 100% missed opportunity for us to have a session go through that didn't do anything to really address the cost of healthcare here in the state for especially our small businesses. And it's something that we are going to continue to advocate for heading into the next legislative session.
Now, on the contrary, there were some pretty significant, positive legislation that was passed that the governor will be signing. One having to do with apprenticeship hiring ratios. A lot of reform happening there. This is a topic we've talked about for several years, but never really saw anything get to the finish line. So tell us about, the reform that happened.
Well, as part of our Reimagine CT Policy Solutions agenda this year, one of the top things that we were pushing for were changes to the apprenticeship ratios for tradespeople here in the state of Connecticut. For decades, Connecticut has had one of the tightest ratio amount that you could have for, apprentices coming into licensed journeymen and masters in their trades.
And specifically, some of the industries we're looking at are construction.
Yep, construction, whether it be heating, air conditioning, electrical, plumbing, those trades are really ones that have had the young people be interested in doing them, but literally no opportunities because the ratios that were required from apprenticeship to licensed contractor were so tight here in Connecticut. So we were successful in working with a variety of different trade groups with labor unions to come up with a solution that actually improves those hiring ratios. And the importance of that is twofold. Not only do you have the workforce that is very much aging right now that needs to be addressed and have more people enter that workforce in order to meet our current needs. But if we're talking about housing, we're talking about economic development here in Connecticut. We need people to be able to build those facilities and those apartment buildings, those houses, those commercial properties across the state. And the only way that we can do it is if we get more young people into the trade. So this is why it's such an important piece of the not only workforce agenda, but also economic agenda for Connecticut.
In terms of, we talked about the increased business taxes, but there was also, a couple of small tax credits, one specifically for the bioscience industry. What can we expect with the research and development there?
Yeah, and another part of our Reimagine CT policy solution was trying to increase the amount of credit that bioscience companies can claim here in Connecticut, because although we're seen as kind of a hub and a big part of the bioscience community here in Connecticut and in America right here in Connecticut, unfortunately, our tax policies have kind of fallen behind our neighbors in New York and Massachusetts. So we were successful in getting that credit amount raised so that they can be more competitive with New York and Cambridge, because that's where a lot of the bioscience community is looking to either grow or expand or start in those communities. So we're able to try to keep them here in Connecticut, coming out of Yale and UConn and all the other universities that we have here in the state, to really have the opportunity to grow here in Connecticut, grow those jobs, and have the opportunity to be a successful business staying here in Connecticut and not moving elsewhere because of this tax credit change.
Yeah, and we know, so much of the research and development happens here in the U.S. that really helps these businesses flourish and thrive, and keeping them here rather than a short drive to Boston or New York is really critical. It's
critical. And it goes to the conversation about workforce as well. These are very high paying jobs that they can recruit internationally to come into the state of Connecticut and work here in the research and development parts of our bioscience community, especially around New Haven and around UConn Health in Farmington and Stanford as well. So these are great opportunities to have really high paying jobs, great businesses that do tremendous work in our healthcare space and in developing these drugs for the future. So to be able to just make a tax credit change that can help attract them and keep them here in Connecticut is such a huge win for us this session.
There was also certainly a lot of regulatory reform. One of the top things that comes to mind is this, antiquated Transfer Act. What happened? What next? I know this is going to continue to be a topic of conversation. We just had our E2 conference this week. I know that our team has been working very closely on this. So, tell us what happened there.
Yeah. So the Transfer Act is a decades-old law that really makes it very difficult to transfer a property here in Connecticut from one ownership group to another if there's any type of environmental issues that could be happening on that property. And in fact, we were one of the first states to kind of adopt this model. And now 48 other states have adopted much easier models in order to try to make sure that economic development, that transfer of ownership can take place. So after 5 years of working group meetings, dozens and dozens of working group meetings between the industries and the state government, they were able to come up with a solution called release-based regulations, which is modeled off of many of those other states, particularly our neighbor to the north in Massachusetts, that makes it so significantly easier for those properties to be transferred, but it also makes sure that there's a stringent environmental controls put in place as well. So this is a huge win for economic development here in the state. The Department of Economic and Community Development estimates billions of dollars in new growth that are potentially available now, that these properties can be unleashed from being stuck kind of in this quagmire of unable to move. And that's why, driving around a lot of the old mill towns here in Connecticut, you see a lot of these derelict factories, and it's really no fault of the owners. They just literally couldn't transfer it because of these really strict environmental rules that we had here in Connecticut. So making this change opens up those properties for new economic growth and revitalization, whether they be tear down and build new or repurposing those properties across the state. So we really see this as one of the biggest economic wins that we've had in decades here in Connecticut. And we're really looking forward to working with our partners in state government in order to implement them in a way that is both timely and also a cost that can be done within our business community to make sure that these properties can get back up and running.
Any other environmental regulatory reform? Yeah,
I would say that as far as regulatory and permitting reform goes, we had a great session for the business community. There was another bill that was passed that was actually proposed by the governor, and we supported here at CBIA, that made it so you can do general permitting and extend those general permits without having to go back and getting approval from DEEP each time. This will make it much easier for businesses to continue to operate here in Connecticut and grow. We also saw some real pluses for small businesses as well. One of the big things that we were pushing for is an analysis on each regulation that comes up on its impact on small businesses. And now the Department of Economic and Community Development and those agencies that are actually implementing those regulations, they will have to do an analysis. And so that the legislators, when they bring up those regulations for review, will be able to see, okay, what's the actual impact on small business if this regulation goes through? So that really gives them the knowledge and the power to be able to make a decision about whether or not this will have a huge impact on small businesses here in our state.
And something that small businesses watch very closely, and large businesses, is the Labor Committee. It's a committee that can have bills come out that really, really help businesses and can win, to grow, but also can very much have a detrimental impact on businesses. What did we see come out of the Labor Committee?
Well, as most sessions, we saw a lot of bills get introduced that would be troublesome, to say the least, for the business community to implement. Things like banning non-compete agreements, to banning non-disclosure agreements, to warehouse worker restrictions, to heat-related businesses having restrictions put on them. Thankfully, those bills did not move forward. Unfortunately, one of the biggest bills that we did track and really push against was providing unemployment benefits for striking workers. That bill did pass both houses. Thankfully, the governor has indicated that he intends to veto that bill. So we're very thankful for his steadfastness on that issue, saying clearly from the beginning that this is not something that I'm supportive of. It aligns closely with the business community's view that this bill will help drain the unemployment trust fund, which will cause every business to then have to have a special assessment in order to fund it. And it really tips the scale, which is really evenly matched right now between employers and employees in labor disputes. This bill would single-handedly kind of tip that scale right over and make it an unfair negotiation between the employers and the employees. So we're thankful that the governor is willing to veto that bill, and we look forward to partnering with him in that effort.
Now, there's always a couple of surprises that kind of pop up during session. This year was no different. We had lawmakers coming together to find a solution after a Supreme Court ruling that would have created some pretty significant cost increases for the business community related to workers' compensation. What happened there? What kind of bipartisanship did you see?
So back in March, a decision was made by the state Supreme Court in what was known as Gardner versus Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services that really upended how we do workers' compensation here. It would have allowed for extended benefits for up to 10 years for individuals that qualify for workers' compensation, certain workers' compensation benefits. This would have cost the business community hundreds of millions of dollars a year in just new annual premium costs. But it also would have cost towns that are also employers. It would have cost the state of Connecticut significant amounts of money each year in annual premium increases. So this was an opportunity for all of us to get together. And we worked with our Conference of Connecticut's Municipalities. We worked with the state government and bringing everyone to the table, and ultimately working with our union labor movement members that came together and said, okay, what can we do to try to address this issue as fast as possible? And this was a perfect example of the legislature being able to activate and getting people on both sides of the aisle, from industry, from state government, from labor, all in the room for many hours of negotiations, coming up with a package that avoids those costs, kind of returns us to status quo where we were for the last 30 years in the workers' compensation system, but also expands benefits for workers in a reasonable manner. So we truly see it as a win-win for everyone involved here, and certainly one for the business community to avoid hundreds of millions of dollars in annual premium increases going forward.
Yeah, it's good to see those type of things, happening, especially how quickly lawmakers act after this ruling came down.
Yeah, with that ruling in particular, it was an immediate effect, which would have led to significant costs for employers across the state, whether you're in the private sector or public sector. So it was a very good thing to see state government come together and act very quickly. Within 2 months, we were able to not only draft a comprehensive bill, but also get it passed through both chambers and signed by the governor. It's really what you want to see state government be able to do in a reaction mode. That was a positive thing for not only employers, but also employees across the state. And we're thankful that members of both parties really saw that it was something that needed to be done as quickly as possible, and we were able to get it through.
So we've kind of touched on a lot of the highs, a lot of the lows. Obviously, there was a lot of legislation in between, and a lot of work that your team was doing to review the thousands of bills that came out this session. Now, everyone's going to kind of take a nap, I think, for a few days. But what's next for the policy team? How can businesses continue to stay engaged? Because the work really doesn't stop here.
Oh, just because the legislative session ended doesn't mean that we're not paying attention to what's out there for public policy. So moving forward, we'll be working with state agencies on implementation of things like the move from the Transfer Act to the release-based regulations and other bills that passed this year. But it's important for businesses to know that we are here getting your feedback, not only from things that just passed this past session, but also things that you would like to see change going forward. So we spend the summer interacting with our business members across the state. We take a real strong look at the survey of Connecticut businesses. So I would encourage any of our members to really make sure that they fill that out by the end of the month, because that really has a tremendous amount of input for us here at the public policy team as to what we could be working on for the next session. We'll be scheduling legislative tours with members of the legislature and member businesses. So if anybody's interested in hosting that throughout the summer, we'd be happy to make that connection and bring in those policymakers right into your business to see how you guys operate. And then we'll also be, going around on listening tours with other member businesses and meeting with them about what's important for them heading into the next legislative session. So the work never really ends. We just kind of start moving towards the 2026 session over the next few weeks with the hopes of having our policy agenda put together in the early fall and adopted by our board in December and hit the ground running for the 2026 session.
Yeah. So if you want to host a member of your team, businesses reach out, because that's, the greatest way to kind of show, hey, this is where the impact will be. And, this is what we'd like to see happen.
Yeah. Hearing directly from that business member to that legislator can have a lasting impact, whether it be the specific issue that you might want to talk to them today, or it's just building that relationship so that if something comes up like the Gardner decision, we need fast action on a workers' compensation deal, that you could just pick up the phone and be able to call them. And in those closing days of session, we often come to you as business members and say, hey, we need you to reach out directly to this legislator that represents you because this big issue is coming up. And we were very successful this year in doing that with a number of businesses across the state, making those phone calls, those emails, reaching out directly to their legislators. So building that relationship in the off session is a big part of that. So if any time a business wants to host a member of the legislature for a business tour, we can certainly help coordinate that.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. We really appreciate your time and everything you did this session.
I appreciate it, Amanda. Thank you very much.
And thank you for listening to this week's BizCast. You can listen, like, and subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us a review and let us know if you have ideas for a future podcast. And for more episodes, head on over to CBIA.com.